Hey there, Happy New Year. It's great to see you. It is Monday, January 1st of 2024. So I just want to wish everyone a Happy New Year, and hopefully you'll have a successful, profitable, and fulfilling 2024. So in 2024, we are doing in my Facebook group in my community, we are doing a 2024 immersion calendar to help therapists understand and learn different concepts related to intergenerational trauma. So all of my live videos and that I do once a week will now be kind of tailored around that content in order to facilitate learning and encourage other people to jump in and work with us on that. So if you want a copy of that calendar, you just go to calendar.barbarawoodsphd.com, and I'll put the link under the video so that you'll be able to get easy access to that. So January's focus in this immersion calendar is going to be on understanding intergenerational trauma kind of at its basics. So what we will be looking at are the basics of intergenerational trauma. My computer's a little stuck where I have my notes. So we'll be looking at the basics of intergenerational trauma this month and the importance of specialization. So the key learnings for January are going to include the basic introduction to intergenerational trauma, neuroscience behind intergenerational trauma, complex trauma in adults or the parents, developmental trauma in the children and teens, and then pattern recognition in families, which this becomes really important when you're dealing with more complex families because you've got to be able to identify these patterns and know how to intervene. So let's start with the introduction to intergenerational trauma. If you've been around me on social media, you probably know a lot of this. It's just the foundational information that's really good for people to know so that they know if they're dealing with it in a therapy session, and then kind of what strategies to use to deal with it and to help intervene. So basic definition of intergenerational trauma is trauma that's passed down between generations, typically through neurobiology and attachment. And the neurobiology is the regulation that the self-regulation that the parent has and the co-regulation that they offer to the child in order to develop self-regulation. So those can be significantly impacted with intergenerational trauma, and they significantly impact the attachment relationship. So when a parent has unresolved trauma, there's attachment and developmental impacts. There's really no way around that because trauma impacts people's relationships and it impacts their ability to self-regulate, which is really kind of the foundation of attachment. So these impacts of developmental and attachment strategies are where the mechanism of transmission for intergenerational trauma is. It's directly linked to the attachment strategies or disruptions and the developmental impacts of trauma that then become carried on into adulthood if they're not resolved. And then we start the cycle over. However, it's very, very important that we also adopt an idea that this is a no blame zone for parents, because parents didn't get the skills that they needed. They grew up in environments that were likely impacted by some type of trauma or attachment disruptions, and they're using the strategies that they know because that's what they've learned over time. They just haven't had different experiences or opportunities to learn different strategies. So we just really need to adopt that no blame zone for parents, because they really are just kind of repeating a pattern that they're stuck in as well. There is a ripple effect of when trauma is intergenerationally passed on. And when we don't address these impacts, the trauma just continues to go through generations. So if you've worked with families that have many generations of trauma or traumatic experiences, you're going to see these patterns, and you're going to see that it's just passed between generations. And nobody really, they just think that's the way we are. We're all angry. We all get really passionate and vocal, and we like to fight people when we know we're right. So you may see that, and they think it's a normal kind of pattern woven in. And to a degree, it can be. It's good for families to be outspoken and to defend themselves. It's not so good when it's not a true threat or when there's faulty neuroception involved. So the transmission patterns, those changes in attachment and developmental impacts, those continue generation after generation if they're not addressed. So if we don't address the parent's unresolved trauma, we're not going to have as much of an impact on the child's developmental trauma, which leads to possibility of transmitting more trauma to the next generation. So, real life scenarios of people who may have experienced intergenerational trauma. Some big ones are survivors of war, genocide. So, right now, there's a lot of conflict in the world. There's the Ukraine Russia war conflict, and there's also the Israel Gaza conflict that is. This is going to have a significant impact on everyone in those countries. And not everyone will develop a trauma disorder, but it's likely to make changes and shifts in how people interact with other people, how they interact with the world, and how they believe the world, what kind of world we live in. Another one would be forced displacement, when people are forced to move out of their traditional homelands, whether it be indigenous people with reserves, whether it be because of floods and natural disasters or taking over land, things like that. That forced displacement and refugee experience can also start these patterns of intergenerational trauma. Another one that I think therapists probably run into quite a bit, but maybe don't connect to intergenerational trauma specifically with the transmission of it, is when a child is separated from their family due to protection or child welfare concerns. So these are the most common cases that I see, where there's a parent who, when they were a child, they were maybe put into foster care, and that has caused some impacts on them, whatever they went through before foster care. And then the experience of being separated from family and not being able to heal and connect with their biological family, that can become a cycle that's then repeated with their children. Another group of people would be indigenous people with the residential schools, the historical trauma, the displacement, and just the reserve system itself. And then also anyone experiencing racism and discrimination, that can also cause intergenerational patterns, because that's a true threat and people need to develop kind of a defense around that, but it can change how they interact with each other and it can change their relationships. So let's look at neuroscience and why it's so important to understand neuroscience when we're working with intergenerational trauma. So it's critical for interrupting the patterns of intergenerational trauma. If we don't know how the brain works and how it affects behavior, development, and attachment, we're not going to be able to pick up on these specific patterns that we see, and our interventions are not going to be as tailored and specific to that individual or that family's situation and needs. So it supports a specialized understanding of the developmental impacts on the child. So we have a much deeper awareness of where these impacts are, why they're there, but also how can we remediate or kind of arrest the transmission of those impacts. It also supports the resolution of the parent's unresolved trauma. We know based on neurobiology that if a parent has unresolved trauma, their parenting strategies are going to be impacted, their relationships are impacted, and their attachments are impacted. So that's going to be a key thing that neurobiology is going to help us understand. So when we start to work with parents and the child, if we don't know how to help a parent to increase their own autonomic regulation. So that's decreasing the fight, flight, freeze responses and faulty neuroception. If we don't know how to support them to do that, that's like the whole foundation of attachment-based strategies. So we have to be able to help them increase their own autonomic regulation, because co-regulation is really the foundation of attachment. And if they can't self-regulate, they won't co-regulate. But again, it's a no blame zone because they didn't get the co-regulation as a child. So our job as therapists is to provide an experience of co-regulation for the client, the adult, the parent. The parent experiences that co-regulation and then develops more self-regulation. And I see my friend Jason is here. It's great to see you. Happy New Year, Jason. It's great to have you here. Okay, so along with increased autonomic regulation, we want to decrease the shame and the impacts of that shame. So their responses are normal reactions to abnormal events. That's usually a statement that we use a lot in therapy, that the way a person reacts to a trauma, that's a normal reaction. It's the situation or the event that is not normal or that's abnormal, and that is the difficulty. So if we can kind of cut through that shame and help them understand that your response, the anger and the fear that you experience when you're dealing with a child that's tantruming, that's normal, but there's a different way. And we teach them those ways. So then they gain a sense of control over those impacts, and it decreases those impacts and gives them a much better sense of self, better relationship strategies, just improves everything. So that improved regulation for the parent provides a more optimal relational environment for attachment and for building that foundation. So when a parent can self-regulate, because they've co-regulated with a parent or a therapist, when they can self-regulate, they can co-regulate their child, and then their child's experience is different, and that transmission of trauma is halted. Okay, so when we talk about neuroscience, one of the most important things to me about neuroscience is that you can apply it. It's really good to know what structures of the brain do what and how they influence each other. But if we can't put that into practical, applied knowledge or strategies, it really isn't going to help us, especially if we try to teach our clients that, because it's going to kind of not be interesting at all, because they want the solutions and the relief of what they're experiencing. So the intergenerational resilience method combines and synthesizes interventions that provide optimal outcomes for treating intergenerational trauma. So this is a blend of a lot of polyvagal interventions. So that's all your self-regulation and co-regulation and the autonomic nervous system. There's also relational neuroscience, child development, and family resilience strategies that are woven into a comprehensive framework. And this is specifically tailored to address the parent's unresolved trauma and the developmental impacts on the child in an efficient and effective framework. So you want both effective and efficient, because that's what's going to motivate the parent to engage in therapy, and that's what's going to give them relief and hope. So the effectiveness is how well do the strategies work, which they need to work to keep people engaged and feeling like therapy is working for them, and how efficient, how quickly do you get some relief for your clients? Because if it takes a year to get any relief or any kind of positive attachment between the parent and child, it's going to be way too long, and they need quick wins right from the start, so that they have more hope and they have more motivation. And when they have hope and motivation, there's less dropouts in therapy, there's less early termination. So it really helps the therapy process to have that efficient and effective framework. And for intergenerational trauma, that's in that intergenerational resilience method. Now, the third area is the complex trauma in adults. So we really want to look at that because that really is the one of the bullseyes and the targets that we need to develop treatment goals around. So intergenerational trauma will manifest in adult behaviors in relationships, and we'll see these patterns in a lot of the families that we work with. So the when the parent has unresolved intergenerational trauma, it impacts their relationships, including the relationship between parent and child, because it impacts the attachment. So you may see them having unstable relationships with partners or getting in relationships that are really unhealthy and hurtful. But that's familiarity for them. That's what they're used to and not comfortable, but it's familiar. So that's a pattern that they've developed that they probably don't even recognize. But it can be a very strong, repeated, unhealthy pattern in their relationships. And that definitely impacts their children and the relationship with their children as well. Unhealthy coping strategies for emotion regulation. So that may be becoming explosive when you're angry, or shutting down and withdrawing, or making kind of verbally aggressive comments when you're frustrated with someone. It can be self-medicating with substances or activities. Um, so those regulating emotions is really difficult sometimes for adults who've been impacted by trauma and it's unresolved. So they learn strategies that work in the early use of those, but then they become problematic in some other way. So they may develop addiction, may develop financial problems if they're gambling, all those kinds of things that are coping strategies for emotion regulation, but they're not healthy. Sometimes you'll see behavioral problems like real impulsivity, so quick decisions without thinking it through. You can sometimes see a lot of aggression or violence. Another thing to look for that may be kind of less obvious is to consider their self-concept and their self-beliefs. Like, how do they see themselves in the world? Do they see themselves as loved and valued and worth taking the time to help and support? Or do they feel a lot of shame and feel like nobody cares about them? They're unlovable. The world is unsafe. Those are really important to learn and understand their beliefs about themselves, others, and the world in general, because these are going to get transmitted to the child as well. So, strategies for addressing these issues in therapy. So this can feel really overwhelming and difficult, but this is built right into the intergenerational resilience method. So complex trauma is addressed in the second phase, and it really depends heavily on polyvagal interventions and a cycle of neuroception. So in polyvagal theory, they talk about how the state creates the story. So the autonomic state that we're in is going to tell us how to interpret what is going on around us or what our experience is. So if we see a dog growling and barking and we have a fight or flight response, our story is going to be dogs are really dangerous. If we see a dog that's growling and barking, we know that it's because there's another dog on the other side of the fence, but they're not really looking at us. That's not going to It's not going to increase our sense of threat or our neuroception of threat, and it's not likely to amplify that state the next time we come around it again. So in the intergenerational resilience method, we work really hard to improve awareness of neuroception, and we're not aware of neuroception as it's happening, but kind of as we look back, like looking at, was that an accurate response to a threat? Or was that faulty neuroception where the response was exaggerated or a little too powerful for the situation, or there was parts of the situation that were missed? That help kind of create that faulty neuroception. And we also look at the somatic experiences, because neuroception and somatic experiences typically precede or come before the autonomic state. So before we have a fight or flight reaction, we might have like some tensing of muscles. That neuroception is going to kick that off. Then you'll get the tensing of muscles. Then you'll get the fight or flight response. So we want to look for those early warning signals of those somatic experiences. And then we want to work with the emotional and behavioral strategies that people use that are common for people with complex trauma. So those may be kind of a collapse or submit, where they just don't engage in anything. They're very shut down. Or it may be more like please and appease, where they put their own needs. They don't even recognize their own needs, and they're making sure everybody else is okay because they're anxious and they feel like relationships are threatening. So the only way to manage them is to give people everything that they want. So we really need to look at those patterns, because with complex trauma, those patterns can be really strong. So the intervention is about a comprehensive transformation of those building blocks of complex trauma, and to create the healing of that unresolved trauma for the parent. And once we do that, the strategies for attachment, the co-regulation, that all improves and creates a different environment and experience for the child. So now we're going to look at the developmental trauma in children. And this is really the heart of our interventions. Our number one client in this situation is really the children, because we want to transform their experience and stop the transmission of intergenerational trauma, because they're the generation that will stop it for the next generation. So if we can stop it in the child generation by healing and supporting the parent and addressing the developmental impacts, it's much less likely to continue into the grandchildren and generations beyond. So trauma, intergenerational trauma, and trauma in general, or complex trauma, has a very significant impact on development. So you'll see obviously difficulties with attachment. There will be strategies that are ineffective. They're brilliant at the time, but if they're used in situations where they're not optimal, they can develop difficulties, attachment disruptions, when relationships are for some reason kind of severed or separated. There's also biological development impacts, where sometimes sensory processing can be impacted, where a child who's had a lot of trauma will get overwhelmed with sensory information because they can't handle the input, because their brain and their mind has been so focused on survival. So those neurobiology and biology kind of things that they need to experience have been very disruptive. And there's also poor medical outcomes. So there can be later in life difficulties with chronic pain, with heart difficulties, diabetes. All of those like medical conditions can be impacted and rooted in this earlier trauma. Affect or emotion regulation is also very impacted. That's from the attachment disruptions, some of those sensory disruptions, that it really becomes difficult for these kids to develop strategies that are effective for addressing their emotions, and especially really strong, big emotions. It's very common for kids with developmental trauma to experience high levels of dissociation. So that's kind of checking out, not being aware of surroundings, not being able to integrate information. So that's going to be a problem in relationships, in school, at work. It's going to be a huge impact for these kids, but a lot of people probably aren't going to notice that or recognize that unless they're a therapist and they're looking for it. There can also be difficulties with behavioral control. So being very impulsive, being reckless, not having a good sense of your body and awareness in space. So maybe being too forceful. When you go to touch somebody else, you kind of smack them rather than just kind of tap them on the shoulder. So there's difficulties with behavioral control, and these difficulties may actually look like ADHD. It has a different root cause, but the behavior can look the same. So it's really important to have clarity around those two different diagnoses. It can also change the way cognitive development occurs. So, when the brain is taxed with survival, the blood flow is not going to go to the higher cortical structures that are developing language, critical thinking, all your executive functions. It's going to be the energy is going to be concentrated in the survival areas. So, there's going to be some impacts on cognition. So, you may see poor language development, you may see learning difficulties, just all those difficulties. You'll really see them in school, and particularly math, because math is something that you have to be very attentive. You have to use working memory, and if you don't have those pathways really strong, it's going to show up there. The last area of developmental impacts is self-concept. So that's how the person sees themselves, how the child views themselves in relation to other people and relation to the world. So this would be, I'm not lovable, I'm not safe, I'll never be good enough. All of those kind of self-beliefs that develop can come and be rooted in intergenerational trauma. So the developmental impact of ongoing childhood trauma, that's those impacts that we just went through, results in complex trauma as an adult. So that's the mechanism of the transmission to the next generation, is if that complex trauma in an adult has not been resolved, and it creates those developmental impacts in the next generation. So strategies tailored for kids. These are amazing. You want to start with the foundation of the parent-child relationship. That is number one in treating childhood trauma, is making sure that the child has a good, safe adult that can help them emotionally regulate, can help them co-regulate, and helps them learn more effective and more helpful attachment strategies. So the way we're going to do that, we're going to start with that foundation of the parent-child relationship, but we're really going to look at decreasing the autonomic reactivity of the parent. Because if the parent has a lot of autonomic reactivity, you're going to see co-dysregulation, or you're going to see kind of attachment impacts that are going to kind of keep transmitting that trauma. We also want the parent to have solid neuroception. So if they have faulty neuroception, where they believe that the child's going to explode and it's very dangerous, but it's like a 5-year-old, they may need some work on that to determine what is truly threatening, because they've been in situations where loud noises are truly threatening, that when their child makes a loud noise, that's going to feel like it's truly threatening, even though in the current situation, it may not be. So we want to improve the parent's attachment strategies as well, and build that parent-child relationship, because that is the foundation for healing those developmental impacts. We also want to improve the child's autonomic regulation. So we want them to have strategies and have the awareness and knowledge to recognize their states, their fight, flight, freeze, and how they can kind of regulate these so they don't have to act impulsively on them. Or if they're really in danger, they use those strategies and everything's good. So improving the autonomic regulation of a child is really through co-regulation with the parent, and sometimes the co-regulation with the therapist. Sometimes you'll find parents are so highly impacted by their own trauma that it takes a long time for them to co-regulate, to be in a space that they can co-regulate with their child. So if the child starts therapy and the parent starts therapy, the co-regulation with the therapist can help build that foundation and experience, so that when the parent has built those strategies, it's much easier for them to connect with their child and to co-regulate. That being said, therapists should never become a primary attachment figure, but sometimes in some situations, we become the first one that kind of lays down those those pathways that helps the child learn to co-regulate and self-regulate later. So we also want to increase family resilience and connection. We want to strengthen those relationships and bonds. And we also want to integrate intergenerational resilience. So even in families that are very violent and have had tons of things go wrong and lots of trauma, there are things in those families that are highly resilient. The fact that they survived is highly resilient. So we have to look for those little pockets, no matter how small they may look or how unimportant. We have to look for those pockets of resilience so that we can kind of integrate those into the family and maximize them in the current generations. So, recognizing patterns is very interesting and extremely important. In this, it's so important that I've developed a kind of an assessment tool that helps identify these patterns, and then we know what strategies and what interventions to use. So, that's the 5 domains checklist that has 5 different domains that intergenerational trauma can impact a family and what you'll see in therapy. If you would like to get a copy of that, you just go to 5domainschecklist.com and I'll put the link in the comments here. So there's basically 5 areas that parents that you'll see in families impacted by intergenerational trauma. So there will be negative impacts on the therapy process itself. So these are really important for identifying hot spots in therapy that may become conflictual or may lead to early termination or lack of engagement. So we have to really watch for these impacts on the therapy process. One of the most common ones that I see is when the parent is unable to co-regulate or they're struggling with the attachment with the child. They still want that attachment. They're just really struggling with it. And if a therapist comes in and can have fun with the child and have really great sessions, the child's laughing and giggling at the end, that can really undercut the parent and cause them to feel jealous of the therapist or frustrated that we're not like setting this kid straight because their behavior is so out of control. So we have to really watch that, because that's a concept in family therapy, that we can have a split loyalty between the therapist and the parent if we're not very conscious of supporting that parent's relationship with the child and building that foundation very clearly so that they understand we're not just having fun with their child, we're priming them for a positive relationship with the parent. The second domain is specific difficulties in co-regulation. This is the co-regulation between parent and child. So you'll see different kind of impacts where the parent has faulty neuroception and interprets a tantrum as a personal event that they can't handle or they can't tolerate. So looking at difficulties in co-regulation. We also want to look at, how does the parent understand or mentalize the child? So is this, they're intentionally driving me crazy? Is this like a child that's possessed, or just like her dad, or things like that, where we want to look at how does the parent understand the relationship with the child, because it's going to tell us a lot about where the parent's at and where we need to do some intervention to support establishing a more positive relationship. There's also number 4, which are parenting strategies that backfire. So parents who are impacted by complex trauma, it impacts their ability to co-regulate, their attachment strategies, and their relationships. So you will find parenting strategies that just totally backfire. So you really want to look for harsh and controlling parenting, or just kind of disconnected and doesn't even care what the child does, and they kind of run wild, because it can go either of those ways. So we really want to know what strategies they're using that can backfire, because that's another area where we really need to get intervention to the parent so they have more effective strategies. They're just using what they know and what they've learned through their own experience. The fifth area is the child's negative self-beliefs. So that is how developmental trauma significantly impacts how the child sees themselves, the other people, and the world in general. And when we need to really look at this, because if we don't address that and don't identify those faulty beliefs or the negative self beliefs, they'll continue on into adulthood and they'll create that loop where the transmission may not be of trauma, may not be as significant or as heavily impactful on numerous domains of child development, but it's still going to impact that, the world is a terrible place and people aren't going to love you and you don't have to get your hopes up. So we want to know what that child's negative self-beliefs are so that we can help shift and transform those. So pattern recognition, recognizing these different patterns is extremely critical in working with intergenerational trauma. And because there's huge differences in impacts and individualized impacts, we have to recognize exactly how these show up. That's the reason that the 5 domains checklist was developed. It narrows those impacts down into those 5 domains, and then it allows you to assess those impacts, and it also helps you to monitor their progress. So it's more of like a living working document than an assessment that you get a score and it's yes or no, or it's different kind of severe or mild. It's a working document where you watch for these patterns over time as you're doing therapy with the family. So for us as therapists, it's really important because of the complexity of intergenerational trauma. It's really important to become specialized and have a lot of very good knowledge and awareness of how it shows up and how we can intervene. So if we have a specialization, if we're working with these complicated families and the cases are very complex, they're overwhelming, you can feel like you're not making a lot of progress, that can lead to therapist burnout, stress, overwhelm. We can get frustrated, we can start to collapse. So it's really important to have those specialized skills. And it improves therapy outcomes. And as therapists, we're involved in getting the best outcomes that we can for our clients. So when there's not progress, it's hard for us too. It's really hard for the client, but it's hard for us too. So when we improve those therapy outcomes, it's because we've got a more expertise in a certain niche area. We can use precise interventions where if you know those 5 domains and you can see there's problems with co-regulation, that's where we need to kind of target. It's much more precise than kind of a generalist approach. You get substantial resources to use with clients. There's 5 workbooks that are in the intergenerational trauma program for parents, kids, and at the different phases of the program. And you can have adaptive treatment plans. So you can change and shift your treatment goals based on what's emerging in therapy. So let's say you get co-regulation down really well, but there's some like behavioral difficulties that are still happening with the child. Then you can use different strategies and you can adapt your treatment plans over time to match the complexity of the family. So there's also benefits of specialization for the therapists themselves. So the increased efficacy and success with clients, it gives us a boost, especially if these are tough cases where we feel like we have some influence, we feel like we're effective, which is really important because we're working with human beings and they're important to us. So we need that efficacy and success in those clinical situations. We can have increased job satisfaction and meaning. Work can take on a whole new life with feeling like you're on a mission to help these families and really kind of develop that niche area and have a lot of more satisfaction. We get more comprehensive skills where we learn how to work with more complex and difficult situations, have those in-depth resources. And we can also kind of stand out in our profession with other people that we've developed some kind of expertise or credibility that really helps us to connect with like people, but also helps us take some pride in our work and to have some passion for where we're going and what we're doing. And you can end up getting increased referrals and retention of clients. If you're a known specialist, a lot of times you'll get those specialized referrals, and people will be really wanting to get in with you because you've got this specialization. Okay. So in the intergenerational trauma program, it's a synthesis of 15 years, lots of training, lots of money spent on training that I put together after working with these complicated families. There's also the toolkit, which is a really easy, it's simple to implement, but it's really for less complex families, but you can still use it in a pinch if you need to. So the intergenerational trauma program is much more comprehensive, and that's where the specialization comes in. There's extensive therapist training. There's extensive client interventions with those 5 workbooks. And it's a 3-phase intervention, but each phase can be used independently. So if you have a person that's not dealing with intergenerational trauma, but is an adult that has complex trauma, you can use phase 2 with that person and use it with a wider variety of clients rather than just cases with intergenerational trauma. One other area that's really important is to have a unique, supportive community for therapists working with this specialization. So that's because of the complex nature of intergenerational trauma therapy. We really need that support of other therapists to sometimes kind of make sense of what's happening, or to have a fresh set of eyes that can see those different patterns that we may not be able to see because we're right in the midst of it. So, my dream is to develop a community of like minded professionals that have specialized in intergenerational trauma and have a really tight, supportive community to have kind of a home to come to. And I think this community would be amazing. So, key learnings for January are going to be just basic intergenerational trauma concepts, neuroscience and how that impacts or interacts with intergenerational trauma, the complex trauma in adults and parents, developmental trauma in children and teens, and then that pattern recognition. So I would encourage you to reflect on how you can apply these insights into your own practice. And hopefully, we will continue to work toward developing kind of this foundational knowledge to determine if you'd like to develop a specialization or not. So I hope you have a wonderful day. Happy New Year's, and I will see you next week.